Hello, New Covenant Parish. Good to be with you again to look at this week's lectionary texts. Today we'll look at a reading from the book of Hebrews, chapter 5, verses 5 through 10. To help us understand the passage, I'll read it beginning at verse 1. Let's do that before we study it. Every high priest, chosen from among mortals, is put in charge of things pertaining to God on their behalf, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is subject to weakness. And because of this, he must offer sacrifice for his own sins as well as for those of the people. And one does not presume to take this honor, but takes it only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not glorify himself in becoming a high priest, but was appointed by the one who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." As he says also in another place, "You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to the one who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, having been designated by God a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Of all the roles, titles, and names we see given to Christ in the New Testament, Son of God, Son of Man, Servant, Prophet, none of these should be more meaningful to our human condition than the role of high priest. It carries the idea of a person who knows the pains and sufferings of life beforehand and can be for us an intercessor, praying for us, representing us before God. This truly is an image we can relate to. It's just a comforting thought to be represented before God by an ambassador, someone fully approved by God, who has fully identified himself with our situation, someone we can totally rely on. Through Jesus as our high priest, we come near to God and receive help from God. And Hebrews 5, 1 through 10, what we just read, is just a tightly packed reading. So to get anything out of it, you've got to read all of it. And notice that the first 4 verses describe the distinguishing characteristics of the Aaronic high priest. He offers to God sacrifices for sins. He sympathizes with the weakness of his people. He shows humility as someone who has been appointed by God to fill this role. Then in the next 6 verses, the same characteristics are mentioned in reverse order and applied to Jesus as high priest, with one important addition in verse 9. Jesus becomes the source of our eternal salvation. So just look briefly at each of these characteristics. First, Christ is not a self-appointed priest. He's given this role by God. And 2 prophetic statements are given in support of this from Psalm 2, verse 7, and 110, verse 4. These draw together the title Son with that of the high priest in just a very striking way when you read them. Now, Son is a relational title that makes us think of obedience, intimacy. And this serves to soften the notion of Jesus being like the unique priest who stands in the line of the mysterious Melchizedek we read about in Genesis. But in any case, the priest who pleads our case before God is bound to have God's ear, because he's not our elected representative, and he's not self-designated. He's God's own choice. And the second priestly characteristic of Christ is that he's fully identified with human weaknesses. That's in verses 7 and 8. And this is talked about in 2 ways. The first connection is that his prayers marked by loud cries and tears in the face of death, meet the priestly qualifications of verses 2 through 4. See, and it doesn't matter whether this reference refers to Gethsemane or Golgotha or the tradition of righteous sufferers in the Old Testament. What it does is it just shows Jesus coming face to face with his own mortality. Just because God hears him offers him no shield from the fear of death or the agony of the cross. He shares fully in the mortality of human existence. And note in verse 7 that Jesus cried and he was heard. And Really striking. Nothing beyond that is promised. No taking away of anxiety or easing of pain. There's no rescue from death. No promise of happiness. There's only a conversation with God. And commentators see a link here, big link here with the story of Job, because while suffering, Job begs for communication with God. In chapter 30, at one point, Job says, I cry to you, and you do not answer me. I stand, and you merely look at me. See, in the story, Job's redemption comes when, after hearing him, God speaks to him. And the conversation, while not easy for Job to hear, means everything to him. All the loneliness, the alienation he'd been feeling between himself and God are done away with. And Jesus also identified with human weakness as it says in verse 8, as he learned obedience through what he suffered. Now, as many of us know, some more than others, a lot more than others, suffering can be a powerful teacher. But the fact that this is said of God's Son, God's chosen, I mean, just think about it. It's just an extraordinary thing to consider. The divine high priest is not immune to suffering, as some have thought God to be. Hebrews isn't going to have any of that. Jesus Christ, Son of God, and our high priest before his Father is not immune to suffering. And the text says it clearly. He actually learns from it. To identify and understand us, human suffering, it becomes God's tutor, if you want to look at it that way. I think that's the way to look at it. And just think about that. And notice here that suffering is not depicted as something evil that has to be fought against and overcome. Not Hebrews. Suffering is seen to be a necessary part of being faithful to God. The readers of this epistle also suffer. Read chapter 10, verses 32 through 34 and all around that. And the readers of this epistle are also encouraged to be instructed by their trials and challenges, to learn discipline. Read chapter 12, verses 3 through 11. They're encouraged because in Jesus, their high priest, they find a companion who sympathizes with their pain and keeps their suffering from leading to absolute despair. And in verse 9, we see the third priestly characteristic of Christ. That is, as our high priest, he becomes the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him. So, on the one hand, this sets Jesus in a very unique role. All through Hebrews, there's a comparison made between the old covenant and the new, between the old cultic sacrifices and the sacrifice of Christ, between the old sanctuary and the perfect tent, not made with hands. I love the way that's said. The new is always seen to be better than the old. And it's the same here, as the Aaronic priesthood is compared to the priesthood of Christ. But Jesus, through his participation in human weakness, facing death, learning obedience in what he suffered, is approved by God. He's made perfect and becomes what the Aaronic priesthood could never be, the source of ultimate redemption. But on the other hand, Jesus becomes a model for all the readers of this letter. Just as he engaged in dialogue with God as the Son obedient to the Father, so those who receive eternal salvation are called to obey him. His example of reliance on God, even while identifying with all our human weaknesses, sets a baseline for our decision to show faithfulness to God. You might say that the whole letter to the Hebrews finds its most important message to us in the last chapter, chapter 13, 12 through 15. Read that. Spend a little time with it, where it challenges its readers, including us, to take upon ourselves a priestly role, to suffer outside the gate, outside the church, as Jesus did. And while we're doing it, never cease to offer sacrifices of praise to God. This is densely packed little scripture, a powerful little passage of scripture. Very good to think about as we make our way through the season of Lent, drawing closer to Christ as we do. Well, good to be with you today, my friends. Look forward to seeing you on Sunday.